Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willow here. A lot of people loved Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, it's looked back upon now as the absolute peak of World of Warcraft, and factually, at least subscriber-wise from the information Blizzard gave us, it was. For myself, however, I'm often asked what was my favourite expansion or favourite period in World of Warcraft's history, and I don't think there's any entire expansion which stands clearly head and shoulders above the rest. In fact, I struggled to say that I like one in its entirety from start to finish. For example, in Wrath, I can already tell you when it happens in our classic timeline that revamped Naxxramas 25 and 10 man is going to be a bit of a shocker. The value in it back in the day was because barely anybody saw the place fully through in actual vanilla. Nowadays, quite a significant portion of the population did, to some extent at least. So when we go back in there and it's been greatly nerfed, we're going to be left with Sartharian's Lair and the Eye of Eternity, which are quite similar to Gruul Mag in two pretty fast to wrap up raids with not too much difficulty there. And then we have Trial of the Crusader, of course, which is when Blizzard made the most optimal way to play your character to complete the raid on 4 separate difficulties each week. So unless they change things there, we have that to look forward to. If I were to try and pick some of my favorite times from World of Warcraft, the first tier of Cataclysm and the heroic dungeons then were absolutely incredible. I love the Nighthold and the Suramar story, progressing through all of that. And I even liked Siege of Orgrimmar and the Timeless Isle release initially when I was playing my Resto Druid then. Well, I liked it before it went on for over a year, that is. But Wrath of the Lich King, the final in the big 3 of the classic expansions, the peak of World of Warcraft's sub-count as it gradually rose over the 10 million mark, and as we make our way through our classic timeline, it is to this day one of the most fondly looked back upon times in WoW's history. A perfect storm of different themes within the game coming together, following up the end of the Warcraft 3 story for the RTS fans, a brand new hero class in the Death Knight, the first new addition to the game, evolutions of classes to make them much more well-rounded, new PvP content, and some of the most memorable raids, and some of the least, looking at you Ruby Sanctum, World of Warcraft has ever seen. And if you never played back then, as somebody who did myself, it was pretty good overall, I'd say. Wrath did a lot of things right that the player base really responded well to. It's no surprise that it was the peak. It also did a lot of things which are now very much looked down upon, which seemingly are often very casually looked over, so not to tarnish the perfect memory. The rose tint is in real effect here. You've seen how people have approached the raiding in Classic, right, and in TBC so far, and I was a little curious as to how the raid content would shape up, having never raided in actual vanilla or the majority of TBC. We always heard that the game was hard back then, and then we got to MC and it was beaten within the first week from level 1, and then you'd hear Veilstraz and Blackwing there, that was the next big wall, and it was beaten within all of 30 seconds, and then wait for AQ, that fell over. Wait for Nax, it was beaten day 1 within 1 hour and 20 minutes, I believe. Maybe I'll do a video looking a bit more into this, but I did actually raid in Wrath of the Lich King though, the whole way through. I never completed all the content on the hardest difficulty possible, but I felt as though I saw it, and how they actually roll out the raids is going to be really interesting to see as well, because something changed with the format of raiding in each separate tier of Wrath. In fact, thinking about it, I am looking forward to Wrath a bit less than I was initially, because I have raided fully through the entire expansion. But back on track, Wrath of the Lich King, for all the good that it did, brought in some real controversial stuff under the hood. We had dual spec, which is now being widely asked for actually in TBC to ease up access to get into heroics or to flip between PvP and PvE. Back in Wrath, it was added in the first major content patch, cost 1,000 gold, and you needed to be level 40. Different from how things are in TBC, where when you change spec, you need to change around your bars, your gear, your talents. In Wrath, you also had to change your glyphs, and glyphs were a pretty huge deal for your power level, different from retail today where they've just turned into cosmetic things. And prior to dual spec, you had to carry around glyphs in your bag so that you could redo them whenever you needed to if you were trying to push the performance of your character. LFG was introduced to allow players to teleport directly from anywhere in the world to a dungeon cross server. And it did get pretty toxic on release, since on one hand you were having the more casual player base who either didn't do dungeons or who put the word heroic up to a dungeon which was going to be really difficult, like it was in heroic raiding. And then you had the more hardcore scene of players who may be leveling an alt or re-rolling or just trying to get some badges for their daily, something like that, in the same content, and there's a bit of clashing between the two different playstyles there. We had heirlooms to speed up leveling as well. We had paid faction transfers towards the end of Wrath of the Lich King as well. I wonder if that'll be in from the start of Wrath Classic. The dungeons and heroic dungeons were just a lot easier, way up to the end of the Pit of Siren, Forge of Souls, and Halls of Reflection in the ICC patch. If you wanted hard PvE content though, the raids did end up making up for it big time. There was essentially a gear reset in each patch with a new set of badges being brought out, which any player could work towards very powerful gear from. And achievements were brought out which in some way gave birth to the Link X achievement if you want to have done something. You know the story, how do you get into a raid? Oh, you need the achievement, but how do you get the achievement? You need to have done the raid. And also from that to some degree, as well as the badges giving anybody really good access to really good gear, came the gear score add-on, because as we all know, the more purples of a higher quality item that people are wearing, the better player they are. Were some of these culprits behind the slowing of the growth of World of Warcraft, or were they the ones keeping it afloat? Over 10 million subs for, well, anything is kind of insane, and World of Warcraft was by no means on a downwards trend moving into Cataclysm, but it also just kind of stopped growing during that first patch. Wrath of the Lich King was very much the peak and the plateau. So what other negatives were there in Wrath? Well, it started to erode away the social aspects of the game more and more with the likes of the LFD for dungeons and heirlooms, which allow players to easily zoom through solo or group content without too much interaction between players. It was the first time that content started to become irrelevant during the same expansion. We didn't have any achievements anymore, and badge gear created an easy path to re-roll or revisit the game during each separate major content patch. This has now become quite the plague in the retail version of the game, where it almost feels seasonal to play during a patch instead of a continuous thing. Your class started to offer less on an individual basis. Gone were the days, as we've seen in TBC, where you need XYZ class to provide ABC buff and optimize your raid. Now several different roles could provide like-for-like buffs or debuffs. You didn't just need a Shadow Priest and only ever a Shadow Priest for mana regen anymore. A Retribution could provide a similar buff, or a Frost Mage at a push, and for the entire raid no less. On top of this, mana started to matter less and less for healers, and one final point which I just can't ignore is somebody at Blizzard really liked mounted combat. Like, more than any player has ever liked it. It was absolutely everywhere in Wrath of the Lich King. Strand of the Ancients, Flame Leviathan, Eye of Eternity, the Oculus, questing. So why on earth was this expansion so popular then if it was riddled with things which were problematic? What did Wrath of the Lich King do that made it so good? People, it turns out, like a story. People like Arthas. People like the Lich King a lot. Even those who didn't play Warcraft 3, he was the central antagonist of the expansion, and from the very moment of the pre-patch where the second Scourge invasion happened, it was impossible not to know who he was and that he was now attacking the world, and we're going to have to be defending it from him. And us having a raid tier Trial of the Crusader, which its sole purpose, lore-wise at least, was to prepare the heroes of Azeroth to assault ICC, was pretty epic. And then at the end of the expansion, we do actually definitively take out the big bad guy ourselves and see that the journey is complete. It was very satisfying end to the story. It became much easier than it ever has been to pick up a new class or specialization due to the gearing path and badge gear that we went over prior. This on top of the leveling journey being continually sped up through the likes of heirlooms. Most classes felt better despite sharing a lot of buffs and debuffs and more fleshed out. There weren't really any total meme specs anymore, which just kind of weren't good for anything, though some were definitely better than others, and there was more reason to class stack now than there was in TBC. But you had a much wider berth of what you actually wanted to play. Those who liked their collections and other meta content were given tabs to collect stuff in, achievements to do, and many more compelling reasons to engage with activity that wasn't just solely raid or PvP. Raids in Wrath got off to a shaky start, but Wrath of the Lich King gave us Ulduar and ICC, and the start of real hardcore raiding in World of Warcraft, which offered newer or returning players something to aspire towards as well. And of course it just had the highest player base, which is generally good for an MMORPG. Lots of people, active world, good arena population, lots of raids and pug content, and just, well, other people. If you think back to one of your favorite times in World of Warcraft, part of it was probably who you were playing with at the time, not just because of the expansion. people make MMOs good, and Wrath of the Lich King had a lot of people. Honestly, the reception to TBC so far has put a bit of a dampener on the whole thing, to be honest, with people looking away from WoW to other MMOs at the moment. I think that initial sparkle of the big three has really started to erode a little bit with us moving from Classic into TBC, and though Blizzard may do fresh, it's not going to be anything remotely similar, and Blizzard hasn't exactly helped the scenario either, what with the 58 boost, the microtransactions, and all the scandals which they seem to just constantly pile on themselves. Remember those comments a few months back saying Classic WoW? No, that's just the TBC waiting room. I wonder how early we're going to see that TBC is the Wrath of the Lich King waiting room starting to crop up. Overall for Wrath though, it was a solid expansion as somebody who played it. I don't think I'm going to get nearly the same experience out of it the second time around though, and by that time other competitors on the market should have some interesting releases out too, a bit of a shake-up in the MMO genre, so rather than constantly revisiting the past, we have something to look forwards to, something unknown in the future. If you started World of Warcraft a bit later than Wrath, you'll probably like it if you do end up giving it a go. It combines some of that retail-esque convenience with the class design and raids of old. I can see now why it was looked back upon so well, but at the same time it kind of gives me a don't meet your hero vibes. Free win for Blizzard though, right? Surely. Anyways, let me know your thoughts whether you played Wrath or not and what you thought about the positives and negatives I brought up here. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and listening in, and I will see you on the next one very soon.